Moment.
Well, Stuart, how are you?
What?
Hello, how are you?
Hello yourself. How are you?
Sounds like Stu.
It's not him.
Looks like Stu also.
All right. Good evening. Apologize for should have start. Get the settings so it starts earlier.
Everybody mute everybody, please.
I will. One of the silver linings of pandemic time. Good evening. I hope everybody is well. Joe Weinstein rubbing it in front of a Dodgers background. Let's see, Mazel Tov. I'm happy.
That's actually a picture of the last pitch of Sandy Koufax's perfect game against the Mets.
Nice.
It's a signed picture. I collect some memorabilia.
Awesome.
Yeah.
No arguing with Koufax memorabilia.
Yeah. Yes.
Perfect. Good evening. We get to start in and the effect on mute is I don't have to hear the news on in the background of anybody everybody on. So we're tuned in. We're tuned into the Gemara for the duration of an hour of Talmud study. So though I will say part of I think there's a general obligation that comes from the Jewish tradition in that we can, and we touched on this last time, and it'll be something that will pop into your head over the course of this class, which is there's a certain level of like, what are we doing here? Why are we doing it? Why ask so many questions? And investigating matters deeply is either part of the Jewish tradition or it is the Jewish tradition. So from like things in the Torah portion this week where Abraham's willing to question God, and where God even says, I'm going to go investigate what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah, even though God in theory should know, to the much larger project of the rabbis in the Talmud asking questions and investigating matters and trying to and questioning each other is part of the Jewish tradition. So that's part of what goes through my head during a strange, intense week like this, which is that looking deeply into things is part of what we're supposed to do. So with that, I want to dive into into where we were in the Talmud. The blessing for Torah study is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu v'tzivanu v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. You say amen. And I can ask, actually, are there hangover questions from last week? If so, you can ask. Otherwise, I'm going to dive right into the to the text and to what we have on the page. I haven't quite to this point used all of the commentary on the page in the Koran edition, even though it's super nice. There's the stuff that's there is really nice, giving you helping you understand who's around and what they're doing, right? For instance, even on the first page, which in an edition of Talmud is the second page, and in the Science Health edition, or at least the one I'm looking at, is labeled page 7. It even like gives you a short bio of people like Rabban Gamliel. So just so that you know, Rabban Gamliel, right, who appears there, He also appears in Pirkei Avot, like we, if you show up on Saturday morning for the Avot class, he pops up there. The and it gives a good bio of him as Nasi of the Sanhedrin, and as one of the pivotal figures who helps establish the Judaism that we can recognize. That's part of like all these guys will establish the Judaism that we recognize. If you remember the story, I told it on the high holidays of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai escaping Jerusalem just before its destruction, escaping in a coffin and then popping out on the other side, and asking the Roman general Vespasian for says, "Give me Yavna and its sages." And if you look even at that second paragraph of the bio of Rabban Gamliel there, and if you have the Steinsaltz edition, the one that looks something like this. Under Rabban Gamliel's leadership, Yavna became an important spiritual center. The greatest of the sages gathered around him, including Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, meaning that the project that became what we think of as Judaism or as rabbinic Judaism is really to a large part fostered under him. Rabban Gamliel sought to create a spiritual center for the Jews that would unite the entire people, a role filled by the temple until its destruction. So again, guys like that, like, why are they figuring out the laws as they go? Because the project of Jewishness in a way has to be reinvented, because they're in a totally new era. When I'm going to zip through the Mishnah, because when you study Talmud, having the Mishnah all but memorized as you go through is part of the deal. It's part of the trick of doing these things. I'm sure this is something I'll repeat again, is to be able to hold multiple things in your mind at the same time. That's part of why knowing the Mishnah well is important. And you'll see as we go what I mean by holding multiple things in your mind at the same time. I had a Talmud teacher I have the right audience for this line. I had a Talmud teacher who would compare it to the entertainment act that one would see on the Ed Sullivan Show. See how I cater classes to the people in front of me. I don't make this reference in Hebrew High. When you would have like the guy who came out with plates that he would spin on and on poles on like broomsticks, and he has to go in like, you do this one, then you got to run over and get that one and keep that going. The Talmud is a mental exercise in that, where they're going to be going around keeping plates spinning on multiple poles at the same time, and you're going to be going back and forth. That's part of the challenge of it, and part of doing that is before you sit down, pretty much each time, be like, you read through the Mishnah so that plate continues spinning in your head, so you always know what to come back to. That will be my only Ed Sullivan reference of the night, possibly of the year. So the Mishnah, if you're at the beginning, I'm just going to zip through the beginning, right? From what time do we say the Shema in the evening? From the time that the Kohanim, that the priests go in to enter to eat their truma, the food that they have been offered, until the end of the first watch. These are the words of Rabbi Elazar. That's opinion one. That's one plate that's out there spinning. And the rabbis say until midnight. So the sages come in contradicting the first opinion. The first opinion is the end of the first watch, whatever the division of their nights are. Like, you got different night watchmen. So till the end of the first watch, which apparently is different from midnight, Rabbi Elazar gets outvoted. Then you had the story of Rabban Gamliel Omer, Ad Shel Amud HaShachar, until the rise of the pillar of the dawn, Rabban Gamliel says, Ma'aseh, and then the editor of the Mishnah comes in with a story. Va'uvanav mived mishtei. His Rabban Gamliel's sons came in from drinking one night from the pub. V'amru lo, and they said to him, lo karinu et Shema. And they said, ach, we forgot to eat the Shema, to read the Shema. Amar lahem, and he says to him, im lo ala mud shachar, chayavin atem likrot. Until the dawn breaks, you are obligated to say the evening Shema. Lo zo bilvad. It's not just that amru that they said. Ela kol masha amru achamim ad chatzot. Every time that the sages say until midnight, every time the mitzvah is till midnight, mitzvatan ala shalom shachar. The mitzvah really is in force. You're obligated to do it until dawn breaks. For all the different sorts of fats and limbs that are offered up on the altar, that you're supposed to finish before midnight. The mitzvah is actually until the break of the dawn. Anytime the Torah says that a certain sacrifice has to be consumed by midnight or on that day, that day means until dawn the next day. If so, why did the sages say until midnight? In order to distance a person from sin. So again, if you're looking in the text, the boldface print is the literal translation. The light face print, the standard print, is the 21st century editor's insertion. What I read was my translation. By the way, saying that anything that you're supposed to eat on one day, you can, the mitzvah of eating it on that day is sort of in force until dawn. What's strange about that Jewishly, even?
That it's the next day?
It's the next day. When, this is something that, you may have found yourself on frequent occasions explaining to people at work. What's a Jewish day? Right?
Sundown to sunrise.
Yeah, we're all into sundown to sunrise. This is
sundown.
Yeah.
You're saying, right, or Sunday. I'm sorry, sundown, right? Yeah, right, exactly. It's not. But I forgot to put into the chat if you want the online version from Sefaria. The next, we're always supposed to be I get all these emails from the ADL trying to warn us against to be wary of Zoom bombing and of people sort of trying to, anti-Semitic folks trying to crash synagogue events and things like that. So you're supposed to watch who you let in so that you know that it's Fred and not somebody else. But I'm the kind of person who just now, when it says random human wants to join the room, and whoever you are, that your name is random human, I always let in random human.
Rabbi,
Yes.
why are they wasting so much print and time on this? These seem to me to be trivialities.
They seem to you to be trivialities.
Things.
Sorry. The end. Sorry, missed the end.
It seems to me that if you say it and you say it twice a day, it's enough. Why are they so important to them to really waste a lot of print space on what time to say it, as long as you do?
Have you ever seen, or you can see, turn on the TV tonight and see a multi-billion-dollar enterprise stop itself to see whether or not a shoe touched a blade of green grass or a blade of painted white grass? So first of all, so that's part of the answer, which is that human culture will zero in on will have rules and practices. So so one is, and that's a trivial example because the NFL isn't important, but they will spend significant time and significant money on tiny things, and that's for something that we all agree is a sort of like essentially meaningless enterprise. This is quite literally understanding what God expects of you in the world. And so part of the answer to the question is that it may be meaningless to some, but to those who felt that the Torah was not just not just an important historical book, but a literal revelation of God's presence in the world, and or that the way that we can best serve God by deeply studying Torah and living Torah and and creating a Jewish culture around it. This is how that took place. So they don't experience that as a waste of time. Now, if you're not the first person to offer that critique, that's a classical critique of all of Judaism, right? I was stopped by somebody's house yesterday to fix a mezuzah on their doorpost. I'm in the congregation, and like there's a way you put the mezuzah on the doorpost, right? You put it on. And the person even said, "Oh, you don't put it here?" I'm like, "No, you put it here." So all of that, all those practices that we know, are teased out this way. So yeah, I think it really is that this is part of how they and how the Jewish tradition has understood like what to do in this world.
Rabbi,
Sir.
you said a moment ago that this was all an effort to understand what God wanted of us, in essence. Is the Talmud really that exercise, or is it an opportunity to get some structure to a Jewish society that the rabbis were trying to spell out an order or a system?
Well, yes, I mean that too. They're not mutually exclusive, right? Like so, there's a lot of this and that. The structure of society, the structure of society is like in order to achieve this thing, right? And because like that's why it's significant, right? That in a sense, like, or why they digging down this deep. Part of it is the for them, it was understanding really again like what God wanted. The effect of that is that it puts structure to society. And I think for us, and my guess is most of the people in the sound of my voice aren't people who think that the Torah is a literal revelation from God. I think what I've seen, if people actually thought that, they would live differently. Right, like there's lots of mitzvot in the Torah, and for us, I actually do think that there's a pathway to holiness and a pathway to a deep way of thinking and a meaningful engagement with sort of what our people have made sacred over the course of a couple of thousand years through doing this, through studying this. So again, like it's it's part of the value, and I think for us especially, is in the delving deep, is in the, if you look at it like wasting like You want to waste time? You ain't seen nothing yet in terms of levels of detail. I think it helps us access different parts of our mind as well, right? Especially in this society where we're prone to being distracted every 5, 10, 20 seconds, every 5 minutes, 10 minutes with another beep, or with being like sustained thought on one topic is itself a benefit to us. When do you say the Shema? I think and one more thing on that, I don't want to say it's a good question. It's actually versions of which I think we'll get every week. That's also the way law works, and people who are lawyers can speak to this probably more intelligent than I can, but I think that in any, the NFL comparison also holds here. In any enterprise where there are rules or laws, the big idea is sort of like easy to comprehend, and we get close to the edge of like what's legal or illegal, or kosher or not kosher, or in or out of bounds. Like as you get close, it seems sort of strange and meaningless, but ultimately you need to draw the line somewhere. So that's why, like, again, we'll watch the Packers are on tonight, right? We'll watch and again, I'm not watching to waste time. I'm watching because I'm a shareholder. There'll be these moments where they're like argue over blades of grass. Did he break the plane? And it's this ridiculous thing, but like that's the way rules are. And the same thing, we'll see it play out over the course of the next however long in terms of the election. You remember hanging chads. That's where laws ultimately have borders, and ultimately on the edges, the discussions seem arcane, but they have to be made if you want to decide whether or not a hanging chad is a hanging chad. All right, next. Thank you. Everyone doesn't get such a long answer, but that's sort of like
a quick question. How did we get to starting the day the night before rather than?
They're going to ask that, right? So they're going to ask that. Like, so by the way, it's a good question, because we in our society, when does today begin? In our society,
in the morning.
Midnight.
So
12:01,
casually we say
yeah.
exactly that. I get up in the morning, the day's beginning, or
midnight,
right? At midnight, or at 12:01, or at something like that, right? If you're looking at an airline schedule or a train schedule back when we traveled, that's the new day, right? Though. Dawn is sort of like, which makes the most sense instinctively?
Sunrise.
Pardon me?
Sunrise.
I agree. Like sunrise is instinctively the most logical. A random point that doesn't exist in nature but exists on a mechanical device does not feel instinctive. That feels totally artificial. Sundown, we'll get to why they end up with sundown. But sunrise does feel the most reasonable. And notice that that's actually what Rabban Gamliel is sort of saying here. Curiously, he seems to think that one day ends the moment before dawn breaks. Or I don't know if I'm using the technical dawn breaks until until light appears on the horizon, actually, is what he's thinking of.
I had heard it came from Genesis, where
Yep. So that's
God said it was evening and morning the first day.
right. So notice that, like that's again like a deep reading of the text, right? Evening. It's in Genesis. It was evening and it was morning. Which comes first? Evening. And by the way, in the there are different ways of reading that, right? So they read it that way. You could say, well, why does evening come first? It's the story, right? Like they're out there living their lives, and then suddenly night comes.
Yeah, but it also says, when God created light, you would think that would be light because, again, before there was light, what was there?
Apparently dark and water.
Yeah.
And what's more is that we have the evening and morning first day, or day one, really it is, and then second day. Uh, um, and the sun isn't created until the third day, right? So whatever the evening and morning is, it doesn't involve the sun. So anyway, but yeah, inquiring deeply is part of what's going on. But especially so, and for the saying the Shema again, this is it's like paying your taxes or getting your ballot in by 8 p.m. on Tuesday evening or anything like that. Like, is there really a difference between 7:59 and 8:01? Of course there isn't. There is no significant difference between those two things. But if you're going to have a system, you need to have like a line on these things, right? And then and again, like sort of like the legal questions now, like sort of are easy to make sense of. Oh, well, if it gets in later, but it's postmarked before, like all those things, you need rules on that, right? So they think of it the same way. The way we treat something like a ballot seriously, the rabbis treat the Shema with equal seriousness. Or, did he cross the plane of the goal line? The way that we treat that seriously, they treat the Shema with equal seriousness. We're commanded to say it in the evening. What does that mean? At what point would I have fulfilled that or failed to fulfill that? And it was so serious to them that last part there, that they said that Rabban Gamliel is saying that they set up rules to distance a person from transgression. They're even putting in a buffer time, right? And you know this from Shabbat candles, right? On your calendar, it says that light Shabbat candles at 4:18. What time does the sun actually hit the horizon? 17 minutes later, right?
I say 18.
18, right? They build in this extra time because we know that if I say do something at 4, or if I say start the class at 7, I'm prone to going and starting the class at 7 when really I should have been doing it at 6:50. So same thing here. Like they're building in a buffer because it's serious. You really wanted to vote, done it days in advance, right? Like this. That's what they're doing. So that's the Mishnah. The Torah, the Talmud is all structured beginning with a Mishnah, and then picking apart that Mishnah. And that second part is called the Gemara. So the Gemara, is from after the time of the Mishnah, and sometimes the whole volume of Talmud is called the Gemara, just to make sure it's confusing. But that's where we're going next. One more vocabulary word before we get there, at least one more vocabulary word before we get there, and that is Tana. Tav Nun Aleph or Tanna, a Tana. A Tana can mean two different things. One is less important, one is more important. The less important but cooler meaning is that in ancient times they didn't have books, like you mentioned, like wasting paper. Like they didn't have books. They didn't have so much paper or ink to waste. So most of this stuff was memorized. Even when they began to write it down, they still had to memorize it. And the people who memorized it were called Tanaim. Literally, it means like the one who teaches, but it was the kind of person who could memorize vast swaths of material and spit it back out at you. So because you couldn't have a library like this, pre-Gutenberg, really. What they did is people would memorize things, and then the sages would call that person over. Come over here. Tell me the first Mishnah in Tractate Brachot. And it was the kind of person who could spit that kind of thing out, right? And you've met people like this who like can memorize stuff. It was an especially prized skill in the ancient world because they did not yet have Google. So that they would do it, and it seems from the rabbis that the less intelligent a Tana you have, the better, because
would make no changes.
Would make no changes. Exactly what Laura said, right? A smart person might say what he, probably he, thinks is right, rather than what was right. So the more like the more robotic the person is, so to speak, the better, because they're more likely just to say it and not to try and like put their own spin on things. So they would call over the Tana. It's part of why it's called the old tradition, right? But that continued long beyond. So that's one meaning of Tana, but the less frequent one, but the sort of, I think, historically more cool one. The second meaning is a Tana is somebody who lived in the time of the Mishnah. So one of the sages in the time of the Mishnah, that's a Tana. The Gemara, the rest of the Talmud is written after the time of the Tanaim. So they refer back to him. And the Tanaim for them are a little bit like the founding fathers are in, use constitutional parallels, to us as Americans, or significant court precedents are, which is to say, the later generations, people who are writing the Gemara, don't think they have the standing to overturn a Tana. They think that these guys had the standing that they don't have, so they shouldn't actually contradict them. You need a Tana to stand on to contradict a different Tana in later generations. So this is part of the pressure of Jewish society, of halachic thought, of Jewish law, which is to say, earlier generations have greater standing because they were closer to Mount Sinai. The closer you are to Mount Sinai, the closer you are to Moses standing on the mountain and actually teaching to the voice, the better off you are, because it's a game of telephone, and the further you are from the source in the game of telephone, the worse off you are. You want to be closer. So the earlier generations have greater standing than the later generations. The flip side of that is that the earlier generations don't have authority over later generations, which is to say, there's also a principle that the halakha, that Jewish law is supposed to go according to the later authority, because Maimonides can't give a good ruling for a halachic question, a question of Jewish law in 2020 in New Jersey, because Maimonides has no idea what the conditions are like in 2020 in New Jersey. He may be smarter. He may be closer to the time of Moses, but he doesn't actually know what's going on here and can't address an actual question to an actual human being. So there are two things that are going to go on. One is that only the people who are actually living and on the scene have enough authority to address questions that are in the present day, and also earlier folks have greater standing because they're closer to Mount Sinai. So both at once, and those sort of exist in tension with each other. Pause. Got it? So this is Talmud, and I say this because the first thing the Gemara is going to do is ask a question about the Tanaim, about the people who wrote the Mishnah. So now the Mishnah is extant, and it's been around for however long, and the Talmud is going to stand in and begin asking about it, and that's the first part under Gemara.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I'm sorry, just before you get to that, you said there's going to be tension between those two issues. None of those people that were closer to Moshe on Mount Sinai are around anymore. So is the power really with the people that are more of the current generations now that are living in the societies that they're trying to address?
Yes. So the question is like almost in terms of force of precedent, right? Which is to say, this is how like the whole halakha system is supposed to work, right? That the rabbi of the present day is supposed to be able to issue a ruling, but to answer a question, but to do so sort of like with the sense that I may know more about the situation in front of me than an earlier generation did because they couldn't have known, but also like that my standing sort of is less than. But that's why that's sort of like you're supposed to have a precedent or a principle from an earlier era.
Right.
Like I had a parallel conversation like this with Rabbi Sisi the other day. We're going to start. I have the flyer all ready to go. A monthly series on the Tuesday nights that we don't have meetings on halachic questions from ritual-y things like how we're dealing with Zoom and things like that on Shabbat and the pandemic, to societal things of like sexual orientation and gender identity and things like this, sort of like how that works. Now the tension is in that if you only say the earlier generations are wiser, so we can't do anything about it, you end up like our brothers and sisters on our right who are loath to change anything because the earlier ages were greater in wisdom and greater in standing, and how can we imply in any way that they were wrong about anything? How could I do such a thing, right? So you keep things exactly as they were. On the other hand, brothers and sisters on our left can say, times have changed. It's wrong to discriminate based on sexual orientation, so we shouldn't do that anymore. Done. The trick is to hold both in balance, which is to say, to try and make sure that you don't say anything that is just that's just what I think and not grounded in the actual Jewish tradition, and not just sort of like slavishly saying like, well, all we have to do is keep things exactly the way they are. So the tension is in those two things. By deferring to precedent is where the earlier generations have their greater say. And part of the check on that is just a sense of authenticity, right? If I waltzed in one morning and said, cheeseburgers are now kosher, like you'd be like, Rabbi, how do you reach that conclusion, right? Because it would feel to you inauthentic. Yeah, don't get excited. It would feel to you inauthentic, like on its faith, and for good reason, right? Like you'd be like how did you do your sums to get to that conclusion? And what you're saying in doing that, or what one is saying in doing that, is like, show me the text of how you could possibly reach that conclusion, right? So that's part of it. So it is that's I think where the tension comes in.
WWTD.
Yeah.
What would the Tanaim do?
Yeah, exactly.
In this situation, yeah.
100%, and that's why if you look at sort of a responsa of later writings on Jewish law from the post-Talmudic period until our own day, that's how it works. Or the law committee in the conservative movement like does the same thing. Like it'll say, here's the question, here are the sources, like here is a conclusion that we draw based on our present situation and on those sources. And the goal is never to say, this is just what I like, because my idea is, and I think this is common, like that you don't listen to me just because you like what I have to say. The idea is that I'm sort of like transmitting the tradition, and I'm like a vessel for it, right? So the Gemara begins. That's the first word of the Gemara. Tana. The Tana Achikai. Dichtani me matai. Says essentially, why is the Tana asking me matai, from when? So he begins. It's like one ant that's wandering around somehow on my wall. So try and leave the window open, like for air circulation in these pandemic days. Anyway, got him. So the Gemara asks, like, what's the Tana doing, and why is the Tana doing it? If you're going to begin a question about a teaching about the Shema, you might ask something more reasonable. Why are you saying, from when do you say the Shema? A more reasonable question would be, lots of them out there. What's the Shema? It's not obvious. The word Shema, or even Shema Yisrael, occurs like 5-6 times in the book of Deuteronomy. It's not like it only occurs here, right? And it's not like it's super clear that if you just read the Torah, that this is supposed to be pulled out and then recited twice a day, morning and evening. It's not in any way obvious. So to just begin by saying, from when do we say it in the evening, seems to have a number of assumptions already going into it. That there is such a thing as a Shema, that you're obligated to say it, you're obligated to say it in the evening, and that there's a conceivable beginning time for that, right? To use the metaphor of the week, what time do the polls open at, right? Like, at what time is it possible for me to begin this process, right? That's not an obvious thing. Before you get to from what time should I do it, you have to know what it is you're doing and what authority it is that you're doing it. Like, there's a whole series of questions that aren't asked. So the first question in the Gemara is like, why are you even starting here?
But you said last week that everything is written as if you know everything that's written after it. So there isn't, that would
Exactly.
answer that question. That we'll get to that later. Just take my word for it now.
Exactly. So that is true, and this is sort of like where we're beginning to get a feel for that, right? This is so I gave the introduction, but the introduction sort of wasn't yet in the Talmud. But so they ask, why begin from when? See, like there's the Steinsaltz commentary around the Mishnah opens with laws concerning the appropriate time to say the Shema with the question, from when does one say the Shema in the evening? With regard to this question, the Gemara asks, on the basis of what prior knowledge does the Tana of our Mishnah ask? From when? It seemed from its question that the obligation to recite Shema in the evening was already established, right? So again, like that's the timelessness of it that Andrew references, right? That acting as if you already know you're obligated, and your only question is, from when does this kick in, without already having told you that you're obligated. Right. So strange place to start. The two and further. Maishna diktani baravit paresha, natani teshachrit paresha, and more. Why teach evening arvit mariv first? Teach morning first.
Yes.
Because
why wouldn't God started the day with light? That's morning, not evening.
Yeah, good, right? So that, by the way, is the flip side of what Bob threw out earlier. Bob's like, oh, well, it says there's evening and there's morning, but that's not obvious, or it's not obvious that's teaching you anything about the Shema. You could say exactly what Fred said, which is, don't go with what God said, go with what God did. The first thing to happen is morning, or like some sort of daylight, right? So teach morning first. And also there's the way everyone lives their lives, which is morning first, right? By everyone live their lives, I don't mean teenagers who, begin with noon. Got teenagers in the house, right? But we, again, instinctively think the day begins with morning, and we track our days from morning. So starting in the morning also, like, sort of, it would be more certainly just as reasonable. We, of course, we know how the story ends. Like, we know that Jews are going to weirdly say, oh, the day begins in the evening. This is sort of like drilling down deep and sort of and asking, well, why is that? That's not obvious to me. So Talmud begins with two questions about the Mishnah. So again, the global view of it is that they feel themselves not as the lower court, as it were, compared to the Tanaim, who are the ones who really set the precedent. We're not supposed to contradict them, but the first thing they do with them is to question it, or to again try to drill deep. This is again in the spirit of primary sources. We always say Jews are proud of saying our tradition encourages questions. This is that going on. They begin with questioning. Tani Akrakai. Next page says so. So this is a next typical Talmud move, which is the authors of the Talmud, we'll get to them in a moment, the answering their own questions. The actual Mishnah doesn't have the questions in it, so they're going to try and say, all right, if I were to do it the way that they're doing it, what would I think? How would I do it? So they're imagining the Talmud is basing himself on the verse from the Torah, Dichtiv b'shof b'chav kumecha. You'll talk to them when you sit in your home, when you walk on your way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And that line begins with when you lie down. And then after that, when you rise up. So what's the first thing you're going to teach? You're going to teach about when you say the Shema, when you lie down, because the Shema itself establishes evening as a first thing, and not as the second thing. Hachikatani, and it is also taught by a Tana. Zman kriyat Shema d'shachrit amit misha'a shekohanim nichasim lachol b'tumatan. So that's why he says, when is the time for reciting the Shema of lying down? When does it begin? From the time the priests go in to eat their truma. So this begin in the evening because the Torah itself indicates evening. Could be unsatisfied with just one answer. The Talmud comes in and offers a second possible answer, one that Bob offered earlier. Or you could say, again, this is, I'll zoom out in a moment. Ya'alif mi vriyato shel olam. You can learn it from the creation of the world. Dichtiv, because there it's written in the Torah, because it says, and there's evening, there's morning, one day. Again, what we said a moment ago. First evening, then morning. B'shofbecha uvkumecha. Each time, evening, morning. You can learn it from either one, is what they're trying to say. Notice here again, there's a few things going on. This is like a little bit more distant view. One, they are willing to question even those they think are above them, as it were. And two, they're going to explore multiple possible answers. They're not going to get one answer and move on. They're going to be like, anything else? And entertain multiple possible answers, because, again, for them, there may be multiple truths out there, right? There could be, now, they're going to have to settle on one standard practice, right? We ultimately can't have two different rules on whether or not you can eat cheeseburgers, because, in the end, like, you want people to be able to eat together. So they end up with like one, where they want to like create some boundaries so that there's a system for it. And also they want to entertain multiple options.
Rabbi?
Sir.
The Code of Jewish Law gives us something on that about a Myriv. It doesn't really say Shema, but Shema is part of Myriv. So it says it should start right after 3 stars in the sky. But it says if you can't do that, you should say it before midnight. But past, if you can't say it by then, you have until dawn to say Myriv.
No, right. So notice exactly that. Like so you're reading from the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, maybe yeah. So that's a 19th century work. So like he's read the Talmud. So you notice like you'll see where it lands, right? Like so the halacha l'ma'aseh, the way halacha is created is like as soon after nightfall as possible. Notice that what Ed read from isn't is meant to be more practical, so it isn't going to say what the Mishnah said. The Mishnah is a lousy law code, if it were a law code, because notice again, from when can you say it? From the time the Kohanim go to eat their truma, which is difficult if you don't have any Kohanim eating truma in your immediate neighborhood. I don't know if they're redlined out of your neighborhood or what it is, but if there's no Kohanim around, you don't know it, right? So you need some sort of other symbol for it, so that's one thing. But you notice how the Code of Jewish Law is going to give multiple options on it, like in sort of descending order of preference. And by the way, notice that the Mishnah asked from when, but most of the Mishnah is concerned with till when. Right. So even though it begins, or the heading is from when, most of the space is concerned not with from when, though we'll get there, but with till when. Yes.
Rabbi, just getting back to that first rationalization about when you lie down and when you rise up, that's why evening was chosen first, because it's when you lie down. Looking at that passage, now I know that's the boldface print, but before that, and I just want to know where this came from, it says you will talk of them when you sit in your home and when you walk along the way, then when you lie down and when you arise. So in my mind, I'm not sure where that preceding phrase come from, because it's not the boldface, because in my mind, if that really comes before it, you're sitting and you're walking along the way, that's daytime.
Right, so that's good. Good.
That's not, so lying down in that, if you include the non-boldface, then that doesn't hold water, because you've got some daytime activities ahead of the lying down one.
Good point. So like here, in that, if you're looking in the same edition, the light face is what the editor is inserting, but everything within the quotation marks is the Torah quote. So the bold, when you lie down and when you arise, is because the Talmud only quotes those words, right? Those 2 words in Hebrew, Shov Chav Kumecha. The earlier part, is when you sit in your home, when you walk on your way, that's in the Torah. But the rabbis aren't quoting it there. They're only quoting the back half of the verse. So one way to read it is the way Joe said it, which is like, well, maybe it's all talking about daytime things, right? Talking to them when you sit in your home, when you walk along the way, those are things you do during the day. You're not walking on your way at night, right? Certainly not in a, you know, in a pre electricity society. Like you're not like the, certainly not commonly. So maybe it's talking about daytime. It comes first. Or you could say, well, this is just talking about like different times you do it, when you sit in your home and when you're at home and when you're away from home. It's just a way of saying all the time. When you lie down, when you rise up, night and day, it's a way of saying all the time. So you could say that. But by the way, Joe, you're like, if one were to read it the way you suggest, would be why they feel compelled to offer the second reason, right? So should somebody say, oh, wait a minute, it says, when you're sitting home and you're walking away, that sort of clearly indicates daytime first before nighttime. Again, logically, the way everyone lives their life. So then they bring the second text. Even if you say that, VR vivoca, there's evening, there's morning. Everyone knows it. We've got another reason on it. But this is the debate, right? So notice that now the debate is always not the something that also will drive everyone nuts. Like not only is like the words of the Torah sacred, but the words of the Mishnah themselves are sacred, and they're figuring out, why is he saying it this way? There's a simpler way to say it. Why doesn't say it that way? So here there's sort of like, it's teaching sort of as we eventually know, we who are living long after, we eventually know, like, oh, like this is teaching that day begins in the evening, right? And you see like that sort of idea beginning to gel here.
Rabbi,
so
is all this, the bowl that we've been looking at, is that all in the middle part when you look at a Hebrew? Yeah. So this is all the middle we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So the everything that's like in the bowl is in the middle, or like the Hebrew / Aramaic that's along the side, and the commentaries either along the side or that he inserts in are often sometimes he's just taking from Rashi. That would be like along the edge of the traditional page, but everything, the boldface stuff and like the Hebrew that's there is what's on the page itself. So this is the page that we would be looking at, the Mishnah, the first word is always highlighted, and then the Gemara begins here, so it's got a couple lines into it. So that so that those are the first two explanations. Those are the first two explanations offered. Again, typically they're looking to establish a reason that's grounded in their best source. Their best source is the Torah, which is to say, sometimes they'll try to derive some conclusion logically, but better than logically is when you can point to a black letter on a white page and say, see, right here, or pull the Tana over and say, begin reciting the book of Genesis for me, and that person does it. All right. That is an hour in. We should pause there, and we're going to continue along. We're going to continue along, and hang with me. Part of I think the value of, again, part of the value of all of this, whether or not one says the Shema in the evening, which you should do, until dawn, immersing ourselves in this pool of thought and logic and argument, I think will be, it's really a tense time, and it's not just politics and who's going to be the next president, but the pandemic and everything like that. And I think it's true in normal life, but especially in a time like this, like living in their world, going to their world for a little while, I think will be healthy for all of us. Pause. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Take
Time
care
for
of
foot-
yourselves. We are
Yeah.
going to be live in person, if you haven't RSVP'd, tomorrow night at 6 o'clock, and also on Zoom. And Saturday morning will be just via Zoom and on Facebook at 9 a.m. for a vote and 9:30 for davening. We'll do it all again next week.
Oh, Green Bay.
Go Green. More importantly, go Green Bay. And when there's an instant replay and they're looking at did he get 2 feet down? You're gonna think of me.
No, we need to save Wisconsin. We need Wisconsin.
Yeah. Right. And in those questions, usually, if whether he was in or out really depends on the color shirt that the guy's wearing.